Some people measure a life by what is left behind in bank accounts or by the glint of expensive jewelry kept in velvet boxes. My family, well, they measured it by the size of the house and the labels on the furniture. They looked at my grandmother, Martha, and they only saw an old woman who had outlived her era. They saw her small, faded house at the edge of town with its peeling wallpaper and its squeaky floorboards, and they sighed. They called it a shame. They called it empty. But let me ask you something before we begin. Do you think a person's worth can ever truly be found in the things they leave on a shelf? I used to sit with Grandma Martha on her porch during those long, quiet summer evenings. She would rock back and forth, her hands always busy with a small wooden rosary. It wasn't fancy. The beads were worn completely smooth from decades of her fingers pressing into them, day after day, prayer after prayer. My cousins never noticed that rosary. My aunts and uncles never looked at her hands. They only looked past her into the living room, counting the dust motes and whispering about how sad it was that she had nothing left to give them. Grandma never said much back then. She just watched them with those deep, patient eyes, and she kept spinning that little wooden cross between her thumb and forefinger. When the winter came, Grandma Martha passed away. She went quietly in her sleep just the way she lived, but her funeral wasn't even over before the vultures started to circle. We were standing in the churchyard, the snow crunching under our boots, and I could already hear my Uncle Richard talking about the property values. He didn't talk about her smile or the way she used to bake bread that made the whole neighborhood smell like heaven. No. He was already calling real estate agents on his phone, right there by the grave. It made my chest ache. It made me want to walk away and never look back. The next morning, the whole family gathered at her house. They didn't go to mourn. They went to sort through her belongings, though they all knew there wasn't much to find. I sat in the corner on the old trunk by the window, just watching them. Uncle Richard pulled open the kitchen cabinets, slamming them shut when he found nothing but old flour sacks and mismatched teacups. My Aunt Sarah went through the bedroom closet, tossing Grandma's handmade quilts into a trash bag like they were nothing but rags. They were laughing. It was a cruel, light-hearted kind of laughter that made me press my fingernails into my palms until it hurt. They kept saying how pathetic it was. 80 years on this earth, Richard scoffed, throwing a dented tin pot onto the floor, and she leaves us a pile of junk and a house that needs to be torn down. I wanted to scream at them. I wanted to tell them about the times Grandma had used her grocery money to buy coats for the children down the street, or how she had spent her nights sewing clothes for the orphanage. But my voice stuck in my throat. I was just the quiet grandchild, the one who didn't have a fancy job or a big car. They looked at me like I was just another piece of the old house that needed to be discarded. Aunt Sarah tossed the black trash bag toward my feet. "Here," she said, not even looking me in the eye, "take her old clothes if you want them. Someone should get some use out of this charity case." That was the low point, standing there surrounded by the people who shared my blood, watching them mock a woman who had given every single piece of her heart to this world. They left the house empty, or so they thought, taking only a few old silver spoons they found in a drawer. They locked the front door and handed me the key, telling me it was my job to clean up the rest because I had nothing better to do. I stayed behind when they drove away. The house was so cold without her. I sat on the floor of her empty bedroom, holding one of her old sweaters to my face, just crying for the loss of the only person who had ever truly understood me. A few days later, a man named Mr. Vance called me. He introduced himself as Grandma Martha's lawyer. I didn't even know she had a lawyer. He spoke with a very soft, deliberate voice like a man who knew the weight of words. He asked me to meet him at the house. He told me there was a final matter that needed to be settled and that the whole family should be there. When I called Uncle Richard and Aunt Sarah, they grumbled. They complained about the drive and they complained about the time, but they showed up anyway. They thought maybe there was a hidden bank account they had missed. They thought there was money. We all stood in the dusty living room, waiting. Mr. Vance arrived carrying a small, heavy leather briefcase. He didn't look like a big city lawyer. He looked like an old friend dressed in a faded tweed jacket. He looked around the empty room, his eyes lingering on the places where the furniture used to be, and he let out a long, slow sigh. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," he said, his voice echoing slightly against the bare walls. Uncle Richard checked his watch. "Look, Vance, we know what she was. Can we just get to the point? There's no money here, we already looked." Mr. Vance didn't get angry, he just reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small piece of paper. It wasn't a grand piece of parchment, just a simple sheet from an old yellow legal pad, but before he read it, he looked right at me. "Martha wanted me to give you something first," he whispered. He reached deep into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was the wooden rosary, the one Grandma had held every single day. My heart leaped and then it sank. Uncle Richard let out a loud, mocking laugh. "A piece of string and some cheap wood. Figures, you can keep that, kid, it suits you." I took the rosary from the lawyer's hand. My fingers brushed against the smooth wooden beads and a strange wave of warmth went through me. It felt like she was right there, holding my hand, telling me to be brave. But then Mr. Vance did something none of us expected. He walked over to the old fireplace in the corner of the room. He reached his hand up inside the soot-stained chimney, groping around for a moment until there was a sharp, metallic click. A small panel in the brickwork slid open. Inside that hidden space sat a small, black iron safe. It was covered in decades of dust and ash. The room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the old floorboards. Uncle Richard's eyes went wide and Aunt Sarah took a step forward, her breath catching in her throat. Suddenly they weren't laughing anymore. They were leaning in, their faces tight with a sudden, greedy hunger. They thought they had found the secret treasure. They thought this was the moment they would finally get rich from the old woman's passing. Mr. Vance cleared his throat and looked down at his yellow piece of paper. "Martha left very specific instructions for this safe," he said slowly. "She knew you would all come here to look for what you value, and she knew exactly what each of you deserved." He turned to the safe and began to turn the dial. Left, right, left. We all watched, suspended in that single, heavy moment. What do you think happens to a family when their true desires are finally brought into the light of day? With a heavy groan, the iron door of the safe swung open. Uncle Richard practically pushed the lawyer out of the way to look inside, but as he peered into the dark opening, his face fell. The color drained from his cheeks. He reached in and pulled out the only thing inside the safe. A small, dusty ledger book. There were no stacks of cash, there were no gold coins, there were no deeds to secret properties. It was just an old notebook with yellowed pages. Richard threw the book down on the mantelpiece in disgust. "Another joke," he spat, his voice trembling with anger. She hid a worthless diary in the wall. The old woman was losing her mind. But Mr. Vance gently picked up the ledger. He opened it to the first page. "This is not a diary, Richard," the lawyer said, his voice turning cold and sharp like winter ice. "This is a record. For 30 years, your grandmother was the trustee of her late husband's true estate. A trust fund meant for the family, a trust fund that she managed in secret." Aunt Sarah gasped. "A trust fund? Where is it? How much is in it?" Mr. Vance flipped through the pages, his eyes tracking lines of old handwriting. "The trust was worth nearly $3 million, he said quietly. Richard choked on his own breath. He looked like a man who had just been given the world, his eyes filling with a frantic, desperate joy. $3 million, he whispered, looking around the empty room as if he could see the money floating in the air. "I knew it. I knew she was holding out on us." But Mr. Vance raised his hand, stopping Richard in his tracks. "Let me finish," the lawyer said, and the silence returned, heavier this time, suffocating. The trust had a specific clause. Martha was given the absolute authority to distribute the funds based on a single condition: the care, respect, and presence her family showed her in her final years. Every visit was recorded here, every phone call, every birthday card, and every instance of neglect. The room seemed to grow even colder. Uncle Richard froze. Aunt Sarah stepped back, her hand flying to her mouth. Mr. Vance looked down at the ledger and began to read Grandma Martha's own words, written in her shaky, elegant cursive. He read about the Thanksgiving when no one called. He read about the Christmas when she sat alone on the porch, waiting for a car that never turned off the main road. He read the words she wrote on the night Uncle Richard told her she was too old to be worth visiting anymore. It was a diary of heartbreak, a quiet, mathematical record of a family's abandonment. According to the terms, Mr. Vance said, his voice steady and unyielding, any family member who failed to visit or support Martha for more than 6 consecutive months is completely disqualified from the trust. Their share is forfeited. He looked up, his eyes resting on Richard, then on Sarah. Richard, you haven't been to this house in 4 years. Sarah, you haven't called since her 75th birthday. The ledger shows that you both, and the rest of the cousins, have inherited exactly nothing. Richard's face turned a deep, angry red. He slammed his fist against the wall, making the dust rise from the floorboards. "This is a setup," he screamed. "You can't do this. She was crazy. We're her children. We have rights." He reached for the ledger, but Mr. Vance calmly moved it out of his reach. "The documents are legally binding, Richard. They have been filed with the court for months. There is nothing you can do." Aunt Sarah began to cry, but they weren't tears of grief for Grandma. They were tears of anger, tears of a greed that had been starved at the very moment it thought it would be fed. They stood there, the people who had mocked the empty house, realizing that the only thing truly empty in that room was their own futures. They had traded a fortune for a few years of convenience. They had looked at an old woman and seen a burden, never realizing they were looking at the keeper of their own destiny. Then Mr. Vance turned to me. The room seemed to shift, the anger of my relatives fading into a dull, distant hum. "There is one more clause," the lawyer said, a small, gentle smile finally breaking through his serious face. He looked down at the ledger, turning to the very last page. "To my grandchild who sat with me when the world grew quiet, who listened to my stories when my own children forgot my voice, who held my hand when it was rough and old and never asked for anything but my company." Mr. Vance looked up at me, his eyes warm. "The remainder of the trust, including this house and the entirety of the $3 million, is left solely to you. Martha's final wish was that you use it to build the life you always dreamed of, a life filled with the kindness you showed her." I couldn't speak, my knees felt weak, and I had to lean against the old trunk just to stay upright. Uncle Richard looked at me, his eyes burning with a sudden, vicious hatred. "You knew," he hissed, taking a step toward me. "You played her. You crept around here pretending to be the good kid just to steal what was ours." But before he could say another word, Mr. Vance stepped between us. "I suggest you leave now, Richard. This house belongs to your nephew now. And if you don't step off the property, I will have the sheriff remove you." They left. They slammed the door so hard the old glass in the windows rattled, their angry voices fading away down the gravel driveway until there was nothing left but the sound of the wind outside. And then, there was just me, the lawyer, and the quiet house. I looked down at the wooden rosary still clutched tightly in my hand. I pressed the little wooden cross against my lips, and I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for years. I didn't tear the house down. I didn't sell it to a developer to build big modern boxes. I fixed the peeling wallpaper. I repaired the squeaky floorboards. I kept her kitchen just the way it was because that was where the love lived. My family never spoke to me again, but that was a small price to pay for the peace that finally filled these rooms. Sometimes, late at night, I still sit on that porch and rock in her old chair, holding those smooth wooden beads. It makes me think about how easy it is for people to miss what truly matters because they're looking for things that shine instead of things that endure. If you were standing in that empty room today, looking at the choices your family had made, would you have the courage to ask yourself what your own ledger might say about the way you love?